For the German grenadier huddled in the splintered ruin of a Normandy farmhouse, survival was a matter of listening. He knew the chaotic, tearing rip of the American advance, the sudden violent burst of the Browning automatic rifle. It was a sound of unchecked aggression, a 20-round scream of lead that chewed through hedgerows and forced men into the mud, pinning them with the sheer weight of industrial fury. To face the Americans was to be drowned in a storm of firepower, a relentless, suppression-heavy deluge that sacrificed precision for volume. Terrifying in its unpredictability and its hunger to consume ammunition. But to face the British Commonwealth section was a colder, more surgical dread. The rhythm changed. It was not a chaotic rip, but a steady, thumping cadence that never seemed to gasp for breath. The German soldier feared the BAR for its ferocity, but he learned to dread the Bren gun for its persistence. He listened to the terrifying coordination of a crew that could keep a barrel hot for hours, snapping accurate bursts that did not just suppress, but hunted. One force tried to break his morale with noise and steel. The other dismantled his position with a terrifying, professional patience that refused to jam or overheat. Today, we uncover the shocking truth about U.S. and British battlefield dominance. To understand the specific texture of fear that gripped the German infantrymen in the hedgerows of Normandy or the rocky slopes of Italy, one must first dismantle the machinery of the Allied squads that hunted him. The terror was not accidental. It was manufactured in the design bureaus and military academies decades before the first shot of the Second World War was fired. The difference between the American and British approaches was not merely a question of hardware, but a fundamental divergence in the philosophy of violence. The American doctrine was born from a restless, aggressive optimism that valued mobility above all else. U.S. Army planners, haunted by the static slaughter of the trenches in the Great War, became obsessed with the concept of marching fire. They envisioned an infantry squad that never stopped moving, a 12-man organism designed to overwhelm the enemy through sheer forward momentum and volume of fire. In this vision, the automatic weapon was not an anchor to sit behind, but a machete to hack a path through the enemy defense. This philosophy birthed the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, or BAR. It was a weapon caught between two worlds, a heavy automatic rifle that fired the powerful .30-06 cartridge from a 20-round box magazine. To the American tacticians, it was the perfect tool for walking fire, a weapon that could be fired from the hip or the shoulder while advancing. It was designed to suppress the enemy heads down just long enough for the riflemen, the primary killers in the American doctrine, to close the distance and finish the job with bayonets and grenades. The BAR man was not a specialist in a static gun crew. He was simply another rifleman, albeit one burdened with a heavier load and the expectation of generating the squad's suppressive noise. He had no spare barrel to change when the steel glowed cherry red, and his magazine capacity limited him to short, violent bursts that ripped through the air like tearing canvas. The German soldier learned quickly that the American squad was a hydra of semi-automatic rifle fire, supported by this singular, roving automatic beast that moved as fast as the men carrying it. In stark contrast, the British Army looked at the carnage of the Somme and drew a darker, more pragmatic conclusion. They believed that movement without a solid base of fire was suicide. The British infantry section was not built around the riflemen. It was built entirely around the light machine gun.
The 10 men of a Commonwealth section were effectively servants to the Bren gun. The section was split into two distinct elements: the rifle group, whose job was to protect the flanks and mop up, and the gun group, the heart and soul of the unit. The Bren was not an accessory to the advance, it was the engine of it. Everything the British section did, every maneuver, every halt, every defensive dig, was calculated to bring the Bren gun into the most advantageous position to dominate the ground. The weapon itself was a marvel of engineering, adapted from a Czechoslovak design that prioritized reliability over portability. Unlike the bar, the Bren was a true light machine gun, fed from a top-mounted 30-round curved magazine that gravity-assisted the feed, preventing the jams that often plagued other automatic weapons in the mud of Europe. Crucially, it featured a quick-change barrel system. A well-drilled Bren team could swap a searing hot barrel for a cool one in seconds, maintaining a rate of fire that could pin a German platoon for hours, not just moments. Where the American bar was a sprinter, exhausting its potential in quick, violent dashes, the British Bren was a marathon runner, capable of laying down a curtain of lead that was methodical, sustainable, and terrifyingly accurate. The German veteran, crouching in his foxhole, learned to distinguish the intent behind the fire. The American fire was a wave, crashing over him to allow movement. The British fire was a wall, erected to trap him in place while the riflemen circled like wolves. This doctrinal schism meant that when a German unit engaged an American platoon, they were facing a storm of individual shooters, a chaotic, fluid fight where every soldier was a threat, but the volume of automatic fire was sporadic, limited by the bar's small magazine and overheating barrel. The Americans relied on the semi-automatic M1 Garand to make up the difference, creating a generalized cacophony of battle. But when that same German unit engaged a British platoon, the dynamic shifted instantly. They were not fighting 10 men, they were fighting a machine gun that seemed to be everywhere at once. The British doctrine dictated that the Bren gunner engage the most dangerous target first, stripping away the German defenses with surgical bursts while the riflemen maneuvered in silence. The suppression was absolute. A single Bren, properly crewed, could lock down a street corner or a tree line with a finality that the bar simply could not achieve. The German appreciation for these differences was not merely academic, it was written in the casualty reports and the frantic radio calls for support. They respected the American aggressiveness, the sheer material wealth that allowed them to waste ammunition on empty bushes just to keep heads down. But they developed a professional anxiety regarding the British section. They knew that once the Bren started speaking, it would not stop until its barrel was changed or its target was dead. The American attack felt like a brawl. The British attack felt like an execution. This psychological weight began to press on the minds of the Wehrmacht long before the armies even met in close quarters.
The German perspective on this lethal dichotomy was rooted in their own obsession with the machine gun. To the Wehrmacht, the Maschinengewehr was the altar at which the entire infantry squad worshipped. Their doctrine was absolute. The machine gun did the killing, and the rifleman existed solely to carry ammunition for it and protect its flanks. When German intelligence officers and frontline commanders analyzed their enemies, they did so through this specific lens of firepower supremacy. They looked at the American bar and saw a weapon suffering from an identity crisis. It was too heavy to be a rifle, yet too light to be a machine gun. German reports frequently noted that while the sheer number of semi-automatic rifles in a U.S. squad was overwhelming at close range, the American unit lacked a true spine
at distances over 300 meters. The bar's inability to sustain long-term suppression meant that once the Americans stopped moving, their volume of fire dropped precipitously. The German Gruppenführer knew that if he could survive the initial violent burst of American aggression, the pressure would inevitably slacken as the bar gunners fumbled with 20-round magazines and waited for their overheating barrels to cool in the damp European air. However, the German assessment of the British Bren was marked by a grudging, almost envious professional respect. Captured Bren guns were prized trophies, often turned immediately against their former owners, a compliment the Germans rarely paid to the bar. The Wehrmacht recognized the Bren as a true light-dis Maschinengewehr, a peer to their own light machine guns in terms of roll, if not rate of fire. They understood the terrifying mathematics of the Commonwealth section. A Bren gunner carried a wallet of spare parts and a spare barrel, tools that transformed the weapon from a momentary nuisance into a permanent fortification. German tactical manuals warned that a British section in a defensive posture was nearly impossible to dislodge by infantry assault alone, specifically because the Bren could maintain a beaten zone, a continuous area of lethal suppression indefinitely. Where the bar was a burst of anger, the Bren was a blockade. This distinction in hardware dictated the geometry of the battlefield. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where engagement distances were measured in mere feet, the American bar was terrifyingly effective, its high caliber and mobility allowing it to punch through earthen banks and wooden farmhouse walls. But as the Allies broke out into the open country of France and the Low Countries, the geography began to favor the British logic. Across open fields, at ranges of 500 or 600 meters, the bar was simply a loud rifle. It lacked the stability of a tripod or a heavy bipod, and its dispersion pattern was too wide to effectively pin down an MG-42 team. The British Bren, however, mounted on a solid bipod and fired by a gunner trained to tap out single shots or tight bursts, remained lethal at these extended ranges. The German infantryman learned that he was safe standing up at 600 meters against a bar. Against Bren, that same exposure was a death sentence. The fear was also a matter of logistics, a dull but deadly reality that every German soldier understood. They knew that an American squad, for all its wealth of equipment, was often disjointed in its ammunition distribution. The barman carried his own load, supported perhaps by an assistant, but the riflemen were focused on their M1 Garands. In the British section, every man was a mule for the Bren. The rifleman carried magazines for the gunner, creating a deep reservoir of ammunition that allowed the gun to speak for the entire engagement. This communal service to the weapon meant that silencing a Bren was not as simple as killing the gunner. Another man would simply slide behind the sights, fueled by the ammunition carried by the rest of the survivors. The German soldier realized he was not fighting a man, but a system, a redundant, resilient loop of loader, gunner, and carrier that refused to break. As the war ground toward the German border, these mechanical differences crystallized into a predictable script of violence. The American attack was heralded by a crescendo of individual fire, a chaotic, terrifying rush that sought to overwhelm by sheer presence. It was a sledgehammer, heavy and blunt. The British attack was a scalpel, heralded by the slow, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the Bren, pinning the Germans' heads to the dirt while the riflemen crept closer, grenade pins straightened, bayonets fixed. The German defender, peering through the dust, feared the American for what he might do in the next 5 seconds. He feared the Brit for what he was planning to do in the next 5 minutes. It was this creeping inevitability, this mechanical patience, that began to crack the resolve of the Axis forces.
To the German soldier, lying prone in the damp earth of a French orchard, the war was not a map of arrows and front lines. It was a narrow, terrified tunnel of vision restricted by the rim of his steel helmet. His universe was reduced to the rustle of leaves and the snap of twigs. When the Americans came, the first warning was rarely a visual sighting. It was a sudden, overwhelming wall of noise. The German Lanza learned that the American method of discovery was often to simply shoot at the landscape until it stopped being quiet. The BAR led this chorus, a weapon that announced itself with a frantic metallic tearing sound, ripping through the foliage with a cyclic rate that sounded like canvas being shredded by a giant hand. The experience of facing an American squad was akin to being caught in a sudden violent squall. The BAR man, often firing from the hip as he advanced in the marching fire stance, sprayed the hedgerow with a cone of lead that was less about hitting a specific target and more about keeping the enemy's head buried in the dirt. For the German defender, this was a terrifying, visceral sensation. Debris, splinters of apple wood, clumps of wet sod, shattered brick would rain down on his position as the .30-06 rounds chewed through the cover. The sheer volume was intimidating. It felt as though an entire company was attacking. The cracks of the M1 Garands blending with the rapid stutter of the BAR to create a deafening cacophony of aggression. The psychological impact was immediate. The urge to curl into a ball, to press oneself deeper into the mud, to wait for the storm to pass. But the veteran German soldier, the survivor of the Eastern Front or the campaigns in Italy, learned to wait for the silence. He knew the fatal flaw of the American rhythm. The BAR's 20-round magazine was a gasp of breath that was exhaled too quickly. In the heat of the assault, an inexperienced American gunner would dump the entire magazine in a single 2-second burst of adrenaline. And then there was the pause. That crucial, frantic fumble as the American reached for a fresh magazine, his weapon useless, his bolt locked back. In that silence, the German MG-42 gunner found his window. He would rise, align his sights, and unleash the Hitler zipper, tearing into the American squad during the very moment their suppression evaporated. The fear of the BAR was intense, but it was transient. It was a fear that spiked and then vanished, leaving a gap for the counterattack. Shift the scene to the outskirts of Caen, facing the British or Canadians, and the texture of fear changed entirely. The silence here was not broken by a chaotic storm, but by a single sharp crack, followed by the distinctive slow thump, thump, thump of the Bren. The German soldier listening to this sound felt a different kind of coldness settle in his gut. The rate of fire was almost lazy compared to the manic energy of the MG-42 or the BAR. 500 rounds per minute, a rhythmic, plodding beat that sounded mechanical and inevitable. But unlike the American spray, these rounds were not tearing up the leaves 3 meters to the left. They were cracking inches above the German helmet, chipping the exact rock he was using for cover. The fear of the Bren was the fear of being seen. The British gunner, firing from a stable bipod, was not suppressing a general area, he was dissecting it. He fired in short, disciplined bursts of 3 or 4 rounds, a technique drilled into him until he could do it in his sleep. To the German on the receiving end, it felt personal. It felt as if the gunner was looking directly into his eyes. There was no spray and pray here. Every time the German tried to shift his weight, to raise his rifle, the Bren would bark again. Thump, 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 and the dirt would kick up right in front of his face. It was a suffocating pressure. The British gunner didn't run out of ammunition in 2 seconds. He tapped away, conserving his rounds, knowing his number 2 was lying right beside him with fresh magazines ready to hand over instantly. The experience of facing an American squad was akin to being caught in a sudden violent squall. The BAR man, often firing from the hip as he advanced in the marching fire stance, sprayed the hedgerow with a cone of lead that was less about hitting a specific target and more about keeping the enemy's head buried in the dirt. The psychological impact was immediate. The urge to curl into a ball, to press oneself deeper into the mud, to wait for the storm to pass. The dread was compounded by the realization of what was happening on the flanks. The German defender, pinned tight by the relentless accuracy of the Bren, knew that the thump, thump, thump was merely the anvil. The hammer was the rifle group, now moving unseen through the tall grass, closing the distance with grenades and bayonets, while the Bren kept the Germans blind and paralyzed. The American attack relied on the shock of the new. The British attack relied on the horror of the inevitable. The German soldier knew that the Bren would not stop, would not jam, and would not miss. He was trapped in a geometry of fire that offered no escape, only the slow, rhythmic countdown to close-quarters combat.
In the claustrophobic nightmare of urban combat, among the shattered brickwork of Aachen or the Ortona waterfront, the distinction between the two weapons became a matter of life and death for the German garrison. Here, the American BAR was a blunt instrument of demolition. A German sniper, hiding behind a masonry wall, learned to fear the sheer kinetic energy of the 30-06 rounds. The American gunner, often unsure of the exact location of the enemy, would simply saw through the wall, turning cover into a cloud of red dust and flying shale. It was a terrifying, jagged experience. The German defender felt the building vibrating around him, the air filling with the choke of pulverized brick. The Americans fought house to house with a reckless, deafening energy, using the BAR to smash doors and suppress hallways with wild bursts that ricocheted lethally off stone surfaces. But the British Bren crew in a city was a phantom. They treated the urban landscape not as an obstacle to be destroyed, but as a fortress to be occupied. A German sentry watching a street intersection might never hear the Bren that killed him. The British doctrine emphasized keyhole positions, firing through small murder holes knocked into walls, or from deep within the shadows of a room, masking the muzzle flash. The slow rate of fire meant the gun didn't climb or buck violently, allowing the gunner to thread rounds through narrow window frames across a town square. To the German platoon trying to cross that square, the street wasn't filled with a hail of wild fire. It was simply interdicted by a single, invisible line of death. Men dropped without hearing the shot that hit them, the crack thump of the Bren arriving only after the body hit the cobbles. A captured letter from a Panzer Grenadier officer in Italy illustrates this chilling disparity. He wrote, "When the Americans attack, it is an avalanche. You can hear them coming for miles. They shoot at the sky, at the trees, at the ghosts.
You hide, you wait, and often you can shoot them when they stop to reload their loud rifles. But the English are silent until they kill you. Their machine gun does not get angry, it just works. You look over the parapet, and the Tommy gunner puts a bullet through your helmet. It is professional work, and it breaks the men's nerves more than the American noise. This was the verdict of the front line. The Americans were a force of nature, terrifying but survivable if one kept their head. The British were craftsmen of slaughter, methodical and precise. But attacking a British defensive line was akin to walking into a threshing machine. The Germans found that a Commonwealth platoon did not just have machine guns, they had a fire plan. The Bren guns were positioned to interlock, their beaten zones crossing to create an X of fire that no human could survive. If one Bren had to change a barrel, the other increased its rate of fire to cover the gap. There was no silence. There was no lull. The German assault waves would wither under a relentless, metronomic hammering that stripped the infantry away from their tank support. The fear here was total. It was the realization that the enemy had calculated the exact patch of ground you were standing on and had dedicated a machine that would not stop firing until you were gone. The psychological toll of this difference cannot be overstated. By late 1944, German interrogations of their own troops revealed a stark preference. If they had to attack, they preferred to attack the Americans. They believed they could exploit the chaos, the noise, and the tactical looseness of the GI squads. But if they had to defend, they prayed not to see the flat soup plate helmets of the British. They knew that once the Bren crews established a base of fire, the German position was effectively already lost. The American bar suppressed the enemy's body, forcing him down. The British Bren suppressed the enemy's mind, convincing him that movement was suicide. And yet, as the dust settled on the battlefield, a question remained. The Americans, with their chaotic, inefficient, roaring firepower, were advancing miles a day, fueled by trucks and industry. The British, with their perfect, terrifying machine gun crews, were grinding forward yard by bloody yard. The German soldier lay dead in the furrow, regardless of which caliber killed him. But for the survivors, the sound of the battle would linger forever. The tearing rip of the bar that signaled a storm, and the slow, rhythmic thump of the Bren that signaled the end. Which one truly broke enemy lines? The answer lies not just in the guns themselves, but in how they changed the very way the war was fought.
The operational consequences of these two distinct philosophies rippled far beyond the hedgerows, shaping the very geometry of the Allied liberation of Europe. The German High Command, studying the after-action reports from the panzer divisions, began to see a pattern that dictated their defensive strategy. They realized that the American squad, built around the furious but short-lived suppression of the BAR, was designed for a war of movement. The Americans were not trying to win the firefight, they were trying to bypass it. General Patton's thrust across France was fueled by this doctrine, a relentless forward momentum where accuracy was sacrificed for speed.
The BAR allowed American infantry to suppress a German position just long enough to flank it or call in artillery, but it rarely destroyed the enemy outright. This meant that the Americans left pockets of resistance behind them, jagged edges of the Wehrmacht that had been stunned but not killed. This reality forced the Germans to adapt their defensive lines against the U.S. sectors into deep elastic webs. They knew the Americans would punch through the initial crust with overwhelming firepower, but they also knew the infantry support would thin out as the BAR gunners exhausted their ammunition and the riflemen tired. Consequently, German tactics against the Americans evolved into a strategy of ambush and infiltration. They would let the noisy, aggressive American columns pass, then re-emerge from the rubble or the forests to strike at the supply lines, knowing the American rearguard lacked the disciplined, interlocking machine gun defense of the British. The German soldier learned that the American advance was a flood, powerful, unstoppable, but full of gaps that a brave man could swim through. In the British sector, however, the war took on a grimly different character. Field Marshal Montgomery's strategy of biting and holding was the strategic manifestation of the Bren gun itself. The British Army, acutely aware of its dwindling manpower reserves after 5 years of war, could not afford the reckless, casualty-heavy dashes of the Americans. They used the Bren to seize a piece of ground and then instantly transform it into an impregnable fortress. When a British unit took a village, the Brens were immediately sighted on the most likely counterattack routes, their fields of fire carefully overlapped. The Germans learned quickly that territory lost to the British was usually lost forever. There were no gaps to exploit, no soft underbellies exposed by a hasty advance. The British front line was a ratchet that clicked forward one notch at a time, and once it locked in place, it did not slide back.
This forced the Wehrmacht to concentrate their heaviest armor and their most fanatical SS divisions against the British and Canadians. German intelligence reports explicitly stated that while the Americans could be delayed by terrain and mines, the British had to be stopped by brute force. If a British infantry division was allowed to set up its Bren guns on a ridgeline, dislodging them would require a massed tank assault that Germany could no longer afford. Thus, the Bren gun, a humble infantry weapon, became a strategic magnet. It drew the Tiger tanks and the assault guns into a grinding war of attrition around Caen, acting as the anvil upon which the German armor was smashed, while the American hammer swung wide and free in the south. The logistical impact of this difference was stark. The American supply chain groaned under the weight of the ammunition required to feed the bars and the Garons. The suppression by volume doctrine meant that millions of rounds were fired at suspected positions, churning the French soil but often hitting nothing. It was a strategy of opulence, a display of industrial might that demoralized the Germans simply by showing how much waste the Americans could afford. But in the British lines, the discipline of the Bren crew meant that ammunition was hoarded and spent like currency. A German position was not subjected to a random hail of bullets. It was dismantled piece by piece. The British efficiency terrified the German quartermasters as much as the soldiers, for they realized they were fighting an enemy that did not make mistakes, an enemy that made every bullet count in a war where Germany was running out of everything. As the armies converged,
a strange synthesis began to emerge. The Americans, bloodied by the Hurtgen Forest and the Ardennes, began to look with envy at the stability of the British section. They saw how the Bren provided a dedicated base of fire that the bar, with its lack of a bipod and quick-change barrel, simply could not replicate. Conversely, British commanders, frustrated by the slow pace of their advance, looked jealously at the organic firepower of the U.S. squad, where every man was a semi-automatic shooter. The soldiers themselves began to adapt, borrowing tactics if not weapons. American gunners started firing in shorter, more controlled bursts, mimicking the British rhythm to save barrels. British sections began to move more aggressively, trusting the sheer volume of Allied fire superiority to cover their flanks. But deep in the DNA of the armies, the divide remained: the American storm versus the British siege.
The shadow of this rivalry stretched long after the capitulation of the Third Reich, reaching deep into the cold mechanical heart of future warfare. When the smoke cleared and the military analysts of the victorious powers began to dissect the lessons of the Crusade, a startling technical truth emerged. The American BAR, for all its heroic service and iconic silhouette, was a technological dead end. It was a weapon of the First World War trying to fight the Second, a heavy rifle that could not suppress and a machine gun that could not sustain. The U.S. Ordnance Department, humbled by the reports from the front, spent the next decade desperately trying to clone the very German machine guns that had terrified them, eventually birthing the M60, a weapon that sought to capture the continuous belt-fed suppression that the BAR had always lacked. The American doctrine of the automatic rifleman vanished for a generation, replaced by the admission that the British concept of a dedicated crew-served machine gun at the squad level was the superior method of slaughter. Conversely, the British Bren gun did not retire. It was merely rechambered. Its design was so sound, its gas-operated piston system so robust, that it served on into the Cold War and the Falklands, a testament to the fact that in 1938 the British had solved the equation of infantry firepower. But the ultimate vindication came from the enemy himself. When the West German Bundeswehr rearmed in the 1950s, they did not look to the BAR for inspiration. They looked to the concept of the Bren, a weapon that could be carried by one man but possessed the heart of a heavy gun. The lineage of the Bren lives on today in the FN Mag and the M240, weapons that form the backbone of NATO infantry, utilizing the same locking mechanism that British troops carried on to Gold Beach. The German fear of the Bren was not just battlefield trauma, it was a recognition of the future. They feared it because it worked, and because it worked, it survived.
Stand today in the deep silence of a Normandy pasture, where the jagged scars of the hedgerows have finally healed under 80 years of ivy and moss. The terrifying cacophony of the summer of 1944 has faded, leaving only the rust of spent casings buried in the chalk to tell the story. But if you listen closely to the echoes of the past, you can hear the distinct rhythm of the alliance that broke the back of tyranny. The German soldier, the expert witness to his own destruction, taught us that the Allied victory was not a singular monolith, but a terrifying harmony of opposites. He feared the American BAR because it was the sound of a nation that refused to wait, a weapon of haste, of overwhelming energy, and of an industrial optimism that could afford to burn the sky to save a single foot of ground. It was the voice of a new world, violent, impatient, and unstoppable. But he dreaded the British Bren, because it was the sound of a people who refused to break, a weapon of patience, of stoic discipline, and of a professional lethal competence that had been hardened in the fires of Dunkirk. In the end, the Wehrmacht was not defeated by a caliber or a cyclic rate. They were crushed between the American hammer, which struck with the fury of a sudden storm, and the British anvil, which held with the immovability of stone. The fear was different, yes. One was the panic of the flood, the other was the dread of the rising tide. But for the liberation of Europe, both were necessary. The chaotic rip of the Browning and the rhythmic funk of the Bren were simply two voices in the same song of freedom. And when they finally fell silent together on the banks of the Elbe, the world had changed forever.